Thinking about the Royal Prussian Army, as it was officially called, from 1701, having evolved from the Brandenburg Prussian Army that had existed since 1644, one thing that immediately comes to mind is the Under King Friedrich Wilhelm I. King's regiment he established with his Blue Boys, as he called the tall fellows. This video reports on the lives of the often forcibly conscripted tall soldiers after the death of the Soldier King. In 1740, his son Frederick, known as the Great or Frederick II, had already started, after just 6 months in the War of Austrian Succession, the first of 2 Silesian Wars, which developed into global conflicts. Then, from 1756, Friedrich's regiments fought in the 7 Years' War, which can also be described as the first of the World Wars. All the major European powers of the time were involved: Blue Austria, Great Britain, the United Netherlands, and their allies against Green Prussia, Spain, France, and their allies. In this war, too, it was about the balance of power and territorial gains in Europe, about colonies and influence in North America, India, and Africa, about control over the transatlantic sea routes, as well as trade advantages. Here is a brief overview of the political and military situation. Prussia wanted to prevent Austria from recapturing Silesia, while Austria under Maria Theresia wanted Silesia back and to isolate Prussia in Europe. Russia under Empress Elizabeth I pursued its usual westward expansion and planned to conquer what would later become East Prussia in order to offer it to Poland as a bargaining chip. Russia and Great Britain under George II wanted to eliminate their main European rival, France, while France under Louis XV in turn wanted to eliminate Great Britain because Frederick II was constantly involved in wars about which many thick books have been written, about his defeats and victories, Prussia's rise to a European great power. It's no wonder that the main historical focus on the Royal Prussian Army is on its battles fought, with all the domestic and foreign policy consequences. But just as interesting is the consideration of the group within the army that was ultimately responsible for Friedrich's victories. That of his officers, from lieutenant to general. They lived by a simple basic principle: God and the King. Under this premise, in 1756, they went to war with their companies, squadrons, batteries, battalions, and regiments. Squadrons, which had cost the small Prussian state a loss of 180,000 wounded or dead soldiers. Among them were 1,500 officers who had fallen or died from their wounds, including a number of generals and regimental commanders. Another 2,500 were wounded and thus rendered unfit for service. On the 14th October, 1758, at the night battle of Hochkirch alone, 246 officers were lost due to death or injury. But never again did the Prussian officer have such a position and enjoy so many privileges as at that time of Frederick the Great. But the price for them was high, because never before or after did the officer experience such strictness in service and the rigorously enforced discipline demanded from above. This particularly impacted young officers. But if one wants to fairly judge the bright and dark sides of their existence, this can only be done by considering the context of that time. Any modern standards must be disregarded. For the daily hardships of a soldier's life, which are unimaginable today, were balanced by ethical values. For example, there was the proud awareness of serving the greatest military leader in Europe at the time, who was admired by the whole world. There was the standard of honor that no other army had achieved, and with it, what was called the Prussian sense of honor. It was this special position in the state, and not least the esprit de corps based on the army's war glory, from which an incomparable sense of comradeship had grown. But despite the esprit de corps, the regiments, as we would say today, remained authentic and passed on this authenticity from generation to generation. Thus, in one regiment, there was an atmosphere that was based on its extraordinary achievements in the war and the extent of its losses, and this led to a certain roughness in their interactions with each other. In another, a pronounced refinement of manners was customary alongside their zeal for duty. A third only associated with regimental comrades as a rule and was always professionally tense, while a fourth was somewhat careless but always among the victors. The fact that, throughout the entire army, there were no other rank insignia besides the narrow feather trim on the general's tricorn hats also outwardly demonstrated the unity of the officer corps. This unity certainly had its social background. This is how Frederick the Great, whom a modern foreign illustration caricatures as the father of militarism, wanted the officer corps to be recruited only from the relatively small circle of the local nobility, preferably only from the houses of the landed gentry, who cultivated little property on poor soil and were often heavily in debt. The fact that the term of the East Elbian Prussian Krautjunker has a negative connotation, which included families such as those of the publicist Maria Grafe Dönhoff, von Bismarck, or Vera Grafin von Lehndorff, is due in part to the aggressive class struggle slogans of the Social Democratic Party in the 19th century. Frederick II often had the younger sons of the landed gentry educated at his own expense in the Spartan cadet houses. But most of the young barons had joined a regiment directly from their parental home. As for the bourgeoisie, the monarch did not trust them with that high sense of honor, which he considered an indispensable prerequisite for the so-called Prussian leadership. That sounds strange today, but one must also consider in this context that at that time there was only a very small educated middle class by today's standards. In contrast, the bourgeois atmosphere was petty, narrow-minded, and often Philistine. In addition, back then, heads of households would hardly have considered entrusting their sons to the uncertain and dangerous career of a soldier. Nevertheless, even in peacetime, there were so-called bourgeois officers in the officer corps, about 10%, although they were hardly considered part of the branches of troops that were seen as decisive in battle at the time. These decisive branches of troops were the infantry. In the 20th century, at the Grenadiers Mott, then the forerunners of the armored corps, the heavily armed cuirassiers protected by a breastplate, of whom people used to say, "The cuirassier is cumbersome. He rides slow and drinks a lot of beer." And also about the dragoons, the forerunners of the armored infantry, there was the saying, "Dragoons are half man, half beast. Infantry put on horseback." Non-noble officers mainly served with the predecessors of the armored reconnaissance units, now the Army Reconnaissance Troops. The hussars, about whom there is also a nice saying, "Hussars ride like the wind once they are mounted." Then also with the artillery, the engineer corps, that is, pioneers, and the fortress or garrison regiments. However, if Frederick II discovered a civilian officer with above-average abilities, he advised, as he put it, to preserve this officer. Preserving often consisted of ennobling the person in question. During his reign, 64 ennoblements in the army became known, although it is likely that there were more. And if one follows the studies published in 1937 in the German Nobility Gazette by the private lecturer Dr. Wilhelm Karl Prince von Isenberg, then nobility was conferred upon soldiers. 47 times in the 50 years, from 1700 to 1750, and 163 times in the following years, up to 1800. These relatively small numbers, considering the size of the army, stood in contrast to the subsequent practice in the 50 years, from 1851 to 1900, when this was applied no less than 692 times. If we take a closer look at the conferral of noble titles, even under Frederick II, there were a number of generals who came from what were then considered humble backgrounds. These were the ones who had basically worked their way up from the bottom. the sons of small merchants, craftsmen, village school teachers, and not least of lower officials with names like Lackstein, Schulze, or Vogt, who all later carried a von before their names. Of the 64 generals in Frederick the Great's infantry, 4 were of civilian origin. Caspar Ernst von Schulze, deceased on the 2nd. December 1757 as lieutenant general and division commander, from wounds suffered in the Prussian-Austrian battle near Breslau on the 22nd November. General of the infantry, Johann Jakob von Wunsch, born Wunsch, general of the infantry. Friedrich Wilhelm von Rodig, who contributed his fortune to a foundation that is still known today as the von Rodig-Scher Legatenfonds in the Bundeswehr. At the same time, the only Jewish lieutenant general under Friedrich, Konstantin Nathaniel Salomo, who was born in Danzig 1710, which was under Polish rule at the time, and later became known as von Salomon. He had first served as a soldier in the Polish army, then in the French army, and had fought in the worldwide war of the Austrian succession until he was discharged as a captain after the peace treaty in 1748. In 1756, at the beginning of the 7 Years' War, Salomo took command of a company in the independent Prussian Free Battalion of Lieutenant Colonel von Kaulben. Here is the Kaulben coat of arms. After his death in the Battle of Leuthen on December 5, 1757, he became his successor. Today, free battalions are often confused with a Freikorps, but free battalions were independent light infantry units that were not used in the usual and rigid attack tactics of the time, but operated independently and flexibly. Von Salomon, who was ennobled in 1760, was then entrusted with economic duties at the fortress of Wesel until his retirement. But ennobling deserving officers who were to be retained remained the exception even under Frederick the Great, as he believed that the number of so-called sword nobility should be kept small. In order to keep the number of non-noble and non-ennobled NCOs who had been promoted to officers during the 7 Years' War low in the active army for reasons of social status, this group was usually compensated with civilian positions or transferred to garrison regiments and invalid companies by the king after the peace settlement. It was only the reform of the army after 1806 that put an end to this practice. But as can be seen from the memoirs of Lieutenant General Daniel Friedrich von Lossow, it would never have occurred to anyone in the army to make a distinction between nobles and commoners. Because, as he wrote, the sword knot made everyone equal, the sword knot also being called a tassel, referred to the strap attached to the hilt and guard of the saber. The rank insignia was initially for officers, later also for sergeants. At that time, the predominantly noble officer cadets, called Freikorporale, also known as Gefreitenkorporale or Fahnenjunker, joined the army at the age of 13 to 15, often initially as standard-bearers. Here, Friedrich the Great assigns 2 Freikorporale, or known as Fahnenjunker, before the fight at Leuthen in that direction. In general, this rank was awarded after the 3-month basic training. But then a Freikorporal, usually living cramped, had to endure a waiting period of several months or even years in the enlisted ranks or as a simple corporal, until he was finally allowed to wear the sword knot as a so-called Trotteljunker. The downside of this youthful entry into the army was that these still very young men had neither completed their upbringing at home nor gone through a reasonably sensible educational path. In service, they were then solely dependent on the favor of their colonel. What happened to their further intellectual development? But even then, times were not rosy, because despite their privileged position as officer candidates, it was, in the long run, a monotonous and restricted existence. Especially if you had to serve in one of the many small garrisons, where personal contact with the so-called other classes was not welcomed. At that time, the officer was completely dependent on his immediate superior, who often displayed exaggerated, pedantic, and gruff behavior as a sign of his dignity. Just as fathers in middle-class families or masters in crafts treated their apprentices in the same way. And as for the relationship with the soldier himself, there was a deep divide during peacetime, which only eased during times of war. The daily drills were monotonous, always in the same place, always the same routines, the same movements, and the same guard duty. Field exercises like today were almost unheard of. And if a lieutenant made a serious mistake during combat drills, any captain could send him straight to detention on the spot. The daily living expenses, especially for young officers, had to be cheap because the pay up to the company commander level was low. Also, due to the lack of money at that time, most parents could only provide support in the form of food, such as, for example, with a ham or food grown on their own fields. Understandably, the latter were more scarce in winter and spring. An officer had rather go hungry than be allowed to cut back on his uniform. So, after deducting the relatively high clothing allowance for the expensive uniform, with its embroidery, the heavy silver sash, a kind of belt or officer's band, a lieutenant was left with very little. He had to get by on 6 thalers, 6 groschen, and 5 pfennigs a month. And as for hunger, General Johann David Ludwig von York from 1814, Count York von Wartenberg, who himself had joined the army at the age of 13 as a lance corporal, had informed his officers, if a junior officer is hungry, he should read his commission and take pleasure in the fact that he enjoys all the privileges of his rank. Only a captain and company commander had a sufficient, sometimes even a very high income. Because although the annual base amount was only a little more than 382 thalers, he could increase it through his own so-called company management, as well as by keeping part of the soldier's pay, which was permitted. For such so-called free guards and those on leave, it could be increased up to 1,500 thalers or even more. Promotion up to lieutenant colonel was done according to the so-called tour, which was basically a regular promotion based on seniority. And if an older officer, a so-called boot or saddle major, reminded the king himself about his promotion, not much more could happen to him than that Friedrich, who tended towards sarcasm, would reply to him, "I have many old mules in the stable, but none has ever become stable master." But if an older officer had been passed over for promotion, that was no reason to ask for retirement. In general, one served as long as one could, and as long as one's strength allowed, and in peacetime, the higher officers were not particularly taxed. This was partly because the training of the troops had mainly been carried out by the backbone of the army, the non-commissioned officers and sergeants. Only during the so-called King's Reviews did the officers had do work more, but even then it remained within limits. Bevos, the units were only at full strength during the few months of drills each year. The promotion periods, especially during the first reign of Friedrich, could be considered quite modern. To captain, Hauptmann, after 13-15 years of service, and after another 4-6 years, to staff officer, major or lieutenant colonel. And if you hadn't messed up before, after 7 to 8 years, colonel. And since the entry age for officer cadets was between 13 and 15 years, with a bit of luck, you could be a general at 43. However, after the 7 Years' War, this promotion practice had slowed down considerably, because the king was now increasingly reluctant to part with his fellow soldiers from the great wars who had grown old with him. As for intellectual life in the army, it was anything but pronounced, and that, even though it was led by Frederick II, who was an intellectual monarch. He had indeed made several efforts to provide scientific education for the young officers, but only a few had benefited from it. Thus, in 1765, Friedrich established in Berlin the precursor to the later War Academy, which was located at Charlottenstrasse 58-59 in Berlin, the Academy of Nobles or Military Academy, where young nobles were to be educated and trained for military and civil service. The thoroughly modern and demanding curriculum included history, geography, philosophy, rhetoric, geometry, fortification, that is, the study of fortress construction, grammar, French, drill, dancing, and horseback riding. Frederick II brought the top 12 graduates to Potsdam to personally introduce them to the higher art of war. These officers formed the cadre for his general staff. In addition, Frederick had younger officers from his regiments receive instruction in various subjects of military science during the winter months. And in fact, there was, although not a very large number, a group of highly educated officers in the army to whom the king had entrusted politically important tasks. And there was also a small number of officers who had studied for a few semesters before joining the service. But to be honest, the intellectual nourishment for the officers of the old school consisted only of the service regulations, the calendar, the Bible, and the hymn book, which for some of the old gentlemen resulted in a rigorous and specifically Prussian piety. A later example is Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, who was so certain in his devout faith in God and an almost childlike piety that he thought God would not let the Germans perish after the First World War, and that was why he had rejected military resistance against the Treaty of Versailles. Friedrich II. However, he had remained skeptical towards religions. The social life of the officers had also played only a minor role, especially in the smaller garrisons. The invitations from younger officers by older, superior officers to a joint dinner, the later so-called Liebesmahle, had not changed that either. Because at all these events with plenty of alcohol, the invigorating presence of women was missing. One reason for this was that the king was very reluctant to grant permission to marry, as he only wanted to see married officers in his army in exceptional cases. Shame on anyone who thinks badly of it. The result of this policy was that many officers lived in so-called common law marriages, with all the consequences that could arise from that. For example, the Ludwig von York I already mentioned was born in 1759 as the illegitimate child of the Prussian officer David Jonathan von York and the Potsdam craftsman's daughter, Maria Sophie Pflug. They were only able to marry, having received one of the truly rare marriage permits from Frederick II when the boy was 4 years old. This odd practice ended with King Friedrich William II, Friedrich's successor, who then also legitimized the semi-official marriages and the children born from them. But despite all these restrictive and seemingly unnecessarily harsh regulations, under Frederick II, an incomparable officer corps, inspired by the finest military spirit, emerged, as their achievements in the wars have shown. It can be said without exaggeration that the Prussian army, which entered the 7 Years' War in 1756, was, in the age of recruited mercenaries, the most perfect military creation as a whole. But as the war went on and the losses I mentioned kept increasing, there was also a noticeable decline. However, the fact that the army still held out for so long and was mainly responsible for Prussia's rise to become the fifth European great power shows. The territorial gains were due in no small part to the merit of the officer. Since I have based most of my observations on the time before and during the 7 Years' War, I now want to take a look at the period afterwards. Like every great long and costly war, this one also led to a profound change in the army. The officer corps had taken on a different appearance. The dramatic losses, especially among the infantry, could no longer be fully compensated for by the likewise drastically reduced Prussian nobility. As a result, Frederick II recruited foreigners, although every German state outside of Prussia was considered foreign. But with the entry of members from different German tribes, the previously cherished uniformity of the officer corps had been disrupted. Even though the High Prussian concept of marriage was still strictly upheld, but even more disturbing than this change in the officer corps was the fact that the aging, completely isolated king made greater and even excessive demands year after year, especially on the commanders. Frederick now lived only out of duty and, after many disappointments, no longer thought much of people. He is said to have once remarked, "The more I see of people, the more I love my dog." It happened again and again during one of his dreaded reviews, when something went wrong, that he would call out from his saddle to the unfortunate person, "The Colonel so-and-so can go to hell." There were two types of reviews: the special review held at a regiment, which had a decisive influence on the further career of the commander, and the general review. These always took place in the fall, just like before. The Bundeswehr or National Volksarmee held large maneuvers after harvest and before sowing to minimize field damage. This also meant that the farmers became available again after about 18 months of training and being discharged into the reserves. They could fill the regiments, which only reached full strength during reviews. For the remaining months up to 10, the soldiers who were relieved into the Landwehr were able to pursue their farming profession. Cavalrymen had taken their horse with them to the farm. Only the foreign mercenaries had to remain in the regiments almost constantly. Then, for the general reviews, larger and larger troop formations had been assembled with which new tactics could be tested. For this purpose, Frederick II repeatedly came up with particularly complicated maneuvers to sharpen the responsiveness of his officers and soldiers, in the hope that this would help them handle the less complicated situations that arise in battle more easily. In battle itself, a unit always fought in a block, but once the opposing armies became interlocked, the commander could hardly influence the course of the fighting anymore. In his later years of rule, Frederick appointed inspectors for the various troop types, who had to regularly inspect the regiments assigned to them and then report back to him. In any case, these maneuvers before the 7 Years' War contributed significantly to the troops being able to decisively improve their combat effectiveness. If you take a look at the second half of the 18th century, a turning point had taken place. The Age of Enlightenment had begun. Education and the bourgeoisie gained importance, and new ideas had emerged, especially from France, which intensified the differences between the rising bourgeoisie and the military. In Prussia, this was partly due to the fact that a small group of young officers now had an unhealthy sense of class arrogance, an exaggerated sense of class consciousness towards the citizens that repeatedly resulted in arrogance, even though, in general, the core of the officer corps had remained intact. Because in all the wars that followed, the Prussian soldier, as well as the frontline officer, performed no worse than in the battles of Frederick II. But it was the top and upper leadership that failed, refusing to acknowledge that the French Revolution of 1789 and Napoleon had fundamentally changed the style of warfare. In doing so, they clung to the old tactics and rigidly adhered to outdated and obsolete principles of peace and deployment. The result came 20 years after Frederick's death. The catastrophe of 1806, which lasted until 1807, was when the campaign against Prussia took place between France and the Confederation of the Rhine, which was allied with France. The Confederation of the Rhine formed on the 12th of July, 1806, at the initiative of Napoleon. The first a confederation of German states was formed in Paris, which was completely dependent on France, under the chairmanship of the Catholic Archbishop of Mainz, Karl Theodor von Dalberg, and it was essentially directed against the allied Prussia and Russia. Here, the German princes of the Confederation of the Rhine, who had seceded from the Holy Roman Empire, are cheering for the French dictator. On the 14th October, 1806, the double battle of Jena and Auerstedt, in which the Prussian army suffered a heavy defeat. And when Napoleon entered Berlin, the old Prussian state was finally laid to rest. Then, in 1807, with the Peace of Tilsit between France and Russia, Prussia had lost almost 50% of its territory. Shown in blue, it had to pay high reparations and had been reduced to the status of a middle power. When the end of Old Prussia was ushered in at Jena and Auerstedt, around 7,100 officers served in Prussia's army. Of those, 6 years later, from 1813 during the Wars of Liberation, also called the Wars of Freedom against French rule over Europe, about 3,900 were still in the army. Many of them held high commands, while others led active units or the reserve formations of the Landwehr. Without them, in whom the soldierly spirit and the ideals of Frederick II's army still lived, there would not have been the Battle of the Nations at Leipzig. From the 16th to the 19th of October, 1813. In this battle, Napoleon and his German auxiliary troops, including Saxons, Badeners, Hessians, Württembergers, Westphalians, and Bavarians, suffered a crushing defeat against the alliance of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden. And ultimately, on the 18th, June 1815, there would have been no Battle of Waterloo either, the location 15 kilometers south of Belgium's capital, Brussels. When English troops under Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, and Prussian units under Gebhard Leberecht, Prince Blücher of Wahlstatt, finally sealed the end of Napoleon as a European dictator. In the battle, which in Germany was still called the Battle of Belle Alliance decades later,